how are you going to make your community know who you are and what you want, and how are you going to carry that message? And I think that all of us in this state carries the message, but how far?
Welcome to Accessing Life, a podcast focused on empowering people with developmental disabilities to live their best life. On this episode, the evolution of inclusion. 50 years since the Willowbrook Consent Decree and judgment created a turning point in the disability rights movement. This special edition of Accessing Life is a conversation led by BJ, remembering lessons learned from Willowbrook's past and celebrating the present and future of inclusion for people with developmental disabilities.
Our moderator, who joins us all the way from Buffalo, is no stranger to advocacy, having been actively involved in advocacy and leadership for over 20 years. BJ is a former president of the Self-advocacy Association of New York State and co-host of OPWDD's Accessing Life podcast. BJ Stasio. Our panelists today include Eric Geizer. Eric is the Chief Executive Officer of the ARC New York, the largest nonprofit provider of supports and services for people with developmental disabilities in New York State. The family-led organization supports 60,000 people and employs 35,000 staff at 35 local chapters across the state. Beth Haroules. Beth handles a broad variety of civil rights and civil liberties issues, ranging from First Amendment issues to government surveillance issues to public health and disabilities issues. Working with New York Civil Liberties Union as co-counsel, Beth is lead counsel in the Willowbrook class action litigation. Henry Kennedy is a parent of a woman with developmental disabilities. He's also an attorney who has served on numerous boards and committees involving disabilities, including the Research Foundation Mental Hygiene Board and the Institute for Basic Research Governor's Blue Ribbon Panel. In 2000, he co-chaired the 25th anniversary celebration of the consent judgment held here at the College of Staten Island. Clarence Sundram is a nationally recognized expert on conditions in institutions and community programs for people with developmental disabilities. He served as a member of the Willowbrook Review Panel, federally appointed to monitor the implementation of the Willowbrook Consent Judgment. Jason Harr. Jason is the Associate Executive Director of On Your Mark Incorporated, one of today's caterers, and serves as the chair of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council. Jason has been involved with the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council for over 10 years and is a strong advocate for the Staten Island community. And last but definitely not least, Chester Finn. Chester is an individual and family advocate at the New York State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, where he has advocated for people with developmental disabilities for more than 2 decades. Chester also serves on numerous state and national boards, advising on disability policy, and co-hosts the Accessing Life podcast with BJ.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Before we start the panel, I have a few things I would like to say. I'm wearing a button in honor of my mom, who was always my biggest cheerleader, my biggest fan, and I have to say she was right. I love you. Thank you. And to Chester, you've always been a great mentor. I love you, dude, and thank you for keeping me out of the trouble you tried to keep me out of. And thank you, Bernard, for leaving a legacy for all the advocates who came after you. And I'm proud to say that I'm a past president of Sandy's. Now, let's get right into the panel, the reason why we're here today. My first question is for Clarence. Clarence, can you tell us a little about how the consent judgment set us up for the future of inclusion?
Well, being a lawyer, the first thing I want to do is start with definitions so we all know what we're talking about. This morning we're talking about inclusion, and in my mind that embraces 4 principles. The first is simply being present. The second is participating. The third is belonging, and the fourth is being valued. So I think when you look at the Willowbrook Consent Decree, the goals in that decree were to provide the residents who were living at Willowbrook at the time with the least restrictive and most normal living conditions possible, and to move them from segregated to more integrated living and programming. For its time, the Willowbrook Consent Decree was a radical departure from the prevailing practices around the country of caring for developmentally disabled people. But the concept of inclusion, as we now understand it, was not widely understood or embraced during that period. Interestingly, the word inclusion doesn't appear anywhere in the Willowbrook Consent Decree and the many thousands of words that it embraces. In fact, most of the language in the Consent Decree and the early energy and focus was on improving the conditions in the institution for the several thousand people who were living there, hiring more professional and direct care staff, improving the physical plant, providing more programming and constructive activity, and the prohibition of the most abusive practices like restraint and seclusion, misuse of medications, and the misuse of aversives. So the consent decree didn't talk at all about inclusion. All of this is completely understandable when one considers the stark horror of the conditions in Willowbrook in the 1960s and 70s. I think just one statistic tells most of the story. There were over 6,000 residents at Willowbrook, and there were 59 nurses. The language of the consent decree that was used to describe the obligation of the state to class members talked about community placement rather than integration or inclusion, and it identified several different types of facilities and programs to be created: hostels, halfway houses, group homes, sheltered workshops, and day training programs, most of which are pretty segregated from normal society. The standard for moving class members to the community was, and I'm going to quote this, "Such placement will offer the individual better services and opportunity for personal development and a more suitable living environment than Willowbrook." That was a pretty low threshold. And honesty compels an acknowledgement that for much of the ensuing years, many of the residences created, people lived in smaller and undoubtedly better places, but they remained largely isolated from the communities in which we lived. We're talking about inclusion and the evolution of inclusion, which recognizes that expectations and conditions change over time. And the Willowbrook Consent Decree was a catalyst for many of the ensuing changes in policy that have occurred over the ensuing 50 years. A few examples. In 1978, the state decided to open up the community residences that were being developed under the Willowbrook consent judgment to people who were living with their families who could no longer care for them. This created an alternative, so parents no longer had to face the horrible choice of either struggling themselves to maintain their loved ones in their family or institutionalizing them. In creating this opportunity, it also allowed the bonds of family and the support and advocacy that one receives to continue as people aged. The changes in policy that also required schools to provide a free and appropriate education to all children further supported the idea of keeping people with disabilities in the community and to help develop and nurture relationships and friendships that could enrich their lives into adulthood. I witnessed this and experienced it firsthand when a family which had a child with severe mental retardation, cerebral palsy, speech impediments, moved in next door. Noah was the same age as my son. They went to school together. They waited for the bus. In school, Noah attended some different classes, but he ate lunch and he had recess with all the rest of the kids. He developed friendships. He was invited to birthday parties in the neighborhood. Noah is a living example of inclusion because today, at the age of 44, he is living in the same community in a house that he shares with people that he got to know when he was in school. There were also other changes like the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was galvanized in large part by changing expectations of people across the country for what was possible for people with disabilities. The Fair Housing Amendments, the home and community-based waiver that provided money to support people in the community. All of these things managed to move us from institutionalization towards inclusion. We can pat ourselves on the back for all that's been accomplished after many years of legal and political advocacy by families, by lawyers, and their allies. But Will Rogers once said very prophetically, even if you are on the right track, if you just sit there, you will get run over. And I think that that lesson is particularly important at this point because things that evolve can just as easily devolve. And we are now living in a world with a Medicaid program that is the engine that has supported many of the reforms and possibilities that we see in community services for people with disabilities. They're being challenged and attacked. The federal programs that support attorneys who do advocacy on behalf of people with disabilities are on the chopping block. The Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, which was a very important champion in the litigation on Willowbrook and cases like this around the country, that whole division is being reoriented to a mission that nobody would recognize as being what civil rights is all about. And there's been an exodus of some of the best and brightest attorneys doing public interest law as a result. And law firms that used to be important allies in doing public interest litigation are being threatened with economic sanctions if they upset the ruling public order. All of this is to say that the victories that we think we've won don't stay won. We have to be vigilant, be ready to fight for them, and to be on constant alert because the encroachments that have consigned people in the past to institutions like Willowbrook, the motivations for that are still with us. So I think the advocacy voices of everybody in this room is important. Willowbrook was important in setting us on the path, but we need to keep fighting for the policies that it has brought us to. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Clarence. Beth, the next question is for you. What do we want to make sure future generations don't forget about the lessons that Willowbrook taught us?
Well, picking up on Clarence's remarks, I want to point to the fact that we are at the most dangerous tipping point that I've ever experienced in my 30 years of working at the New York Civil Liberties Union and monitoring the entitlements of the class under both the consent judgment and the permanent injunction. We have a federal government that does not understand people with disabilities, that do not like people with disabilities, and do not want to support people with disabilities. The movement is being led by RFK Jr., to his shame, who wants to turn back the decades of progress that were started when his father went into Willowbrook, as you saw in the trailer, and revealed the snake pit conditions of the Willowbrook State School. We cannot go back, but I have to say that progress forward in ensuring the entitlements of the class has been very rocky over the years. It is tied almost exclusively to funding. We have deficits that we are facing, which have faced the state before, but we've never had an unwilling federal government acknowledging its obligation to provide assistance to people to live their fullest and best lives. The meanings of inclusion that we're here to talk about today, much progress has been made, but inclusion is not actually a reality when you have bigoted, biased, ableist individuals who control the political landscape, who control the budget, who are able to object to people moving into communities. We have the Padavin law in New York State, which came out of Willowbrook, which allows the commissioner to override local opposition to the siting of a group home. That law is something that has fallen into disuse. We have routinely large-scale, loud opposition to people with disabilities living their lives in community as your next-door neighbors. We have to ensure that people understand that when you have a workforce that is not supported, that is not respected, that is not compensated, you will recreate the situations that led to Willowbrook, where you had understaffing, overpopulation, people with extreme needs whose needs could not be met. You dehumanize people with disabilities when you dehumanize the workforce who supplement the aid of family members and friends and loved ones in helping people who need help to live their best lives in communities. You know, as Clarence noted, when you look at the consent judgment, it is an astonishing roadmap for the way to actually provide and recognize the humanity of individuals. They barred, forced labor because there were people at Willowbrook who were impressed into working for the state. They set out specifically how to feed people, what mealtime looks like. They banned prone feeding of individuals because people would choke and die. We're facing that situation currently, where there's insufficient staff to make sure that people can safely intake food and water. All of these items that you see in the consent judgment, which morphed into the permanent injunction in 1993, the injunction was entered in recognition of the fact that we were no longer looking at how to operate safely, protect people from harm in institutional settings. But the permanent injunction carried with it all of the obligations to ensure protection from harm, to avoid experimentation. I'm not sure how many people understand that most of the class members are hepatitis B carriers because they were experimented on, injected with live virus so that the military could develop a hepatitis B vaccine. That hepatitis B status has followed the class along through the days of HIV/AIDS, when Hep B was a marker for HIV/AIDS. It prohibited people from accessing medical services in medical facilities that are supposed to serve everyone because people with Hep B markers appear to be HIV carriers. And it leads to a diminished life expectancy with additional medical conditions, cancer, and the like, manifesting as people age. There is a bar against experimentation, but what we've heard recently with the creation of the autism registry in aid of research without people's consent really has the actual turning back of the clock to these bad days. So, there are an awful lot of issues that I think we need to be very concerned about. Having the trailers, ensuring the workforce is trained on all of these items. This is a difficult job to support people on a 24/7 basis when there is insufficient oversight by supervisors, by quality assurance individuals for people who are living in congregate settings and group homes, not in their own settings with family. If you don't have the oversight, things happen. Things happen, staff will defend each other. You will have an impenetrable barrier to understanding what takes place when incidents happen, as they inevitably do. So, I think that the call is back to the ramparts. Martin Luther King Jr. said that a revolution is not a one-time occurrence. It is ongoing dedication, vigilance to seek social justice, to seek meaningful change, and to ensure that that change, in fact, is durable. We are in a place where I think all of those thoughts, theories, the social justice movement is under extreme risk of being run right into the dark ages. Clarence mentioned the law firms, the public interest law firms, who are being disincentivized from participating in public interest law. The ACLU has been with other not-for-profit entities challenged in terms of IRS investigations, loss of tax-exempt status, investigations and the like. All of this is ending up in a place where people are afraid to assert the rights of people, whether it's people, as Goody referred to this morning, who can't speak for themselves, or individuals, our loved ones and friends who are able to speak for themselves. People need to be seen, they need to be included, and we can't turn the clocks back.
Thank you, Beth. Hal, next question is for you. How has family advocacy influenced the trajectory of inclusion for people with developmental disabilities?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here today. Before I start talking a little bit about the judgment, I'd like to mention that in our audience is a gentleman who actually negotiated and helped write the consent judgment. His name is Peter Goldmark, and I hope, Peter, you're still here, and if you are, stand up. May have left, don't know, I guess he left. But in any event, Peter was the director of the budget in 1975 under Governor Carey, and he had two hats to wear. One was to keep New York City out of bankruptcy, and the other to negotiate the Willowbrook consent judgment. And on both fronts, I think he did okay. The judgment. I actually haul around a copy of it, all 29 pages. It's a document that not only closed the Willowbrook State School, or set in motion to close the Willowbrook State School, but it's really a document of hope. It is in many respects like some of our founding documents. It's living and continues to live. I think the best way for me to talk about the issue or the question about the trajectory of advocacy and inclusion is to talk a little bit about myself and how it was that I became involved. Now, my daughter was born with a developmental disability in 1982. That was 7 years after the consent judgment. And frankly, for a period of time, I didn't really understand Willowbrook. I went to in 1999, the 50th anniversary of the ARC, New York City, AHRC, their celebration. And they had two speakers, Ralph Nader and Tom Coughlin. And we know Ralph Nader. He was a social activist, Unsafe at Any Speed, for those old enough to remember the book. And Tom Coughlin, who was the first commissioner of OMRDD and was actually the supervisor who helped close Willowbrook. Both of those gentlemen spoke at length about Willowbrook and the consent judgment, and they both spoke about parents' involvement and attorneys' involvement. And they spoke very highly of both of those. And I sat in the audience and I thought to myself, I'm a parent, and I'm a lawyer, and I'm a resident of Staten Island, and I know very little about Willowbrook, and I know very little about the Willowbrook consent judgment. So I went home that night, and this was, I think, the internet was just taking off, but I pulled the Encyclopedia of New York City off the shelf, and I saw that April 30th, 1975 was the signing of the judgment. And of course, I did a bit of math, and I realized that therefore the 25th anniversary would be coming up. I reached out to some people in the disability community and said, what are you doing about some celebratory event? And there was nothing going on. So I took it upon myself to reach out, and before I knew it, I was co-chairing a celebration which we held here. But what I also did is that I started to read a little bit, and of course I went to the Bible, the Willowbrook Wars, which is a great book, and I went to the Staten Island Advance articles by Jane Curtin, and then I went out and I got the judgment. And I sat down, made a copy, and sat at my dining room table and started to read the judgment. And anyone who does read it will come to realize what an important and moving document this is. It's set out in 29 pages, and as Beth was mentioning and Clarence has mentioned, went through every sort of aspect of the person's life who was living at Willowbrook at the time. It addressed all of the issues. It addressed residential living. It addressed the environment. It addressed education, as Clarence had noted, and the language in it. You know, education, this is the way the consent judgment read. The education philosophy shall be that all residents are presumed to be capable of benefiting from education. What a profound statement. And of course, some of us will look at that and say, profound? That's a silly statement. Of course, that's what we think of education. But the drafters of the consent judgment, they realized that they needed to put that in to make sure that everybody got it. The food and nutrition services, as Beth was mentioning, here's the language. Consistent with their capabilities and handicaps, residents shall be taught to feed themselves and shall be fed both hot and cold foods and beverages in a normal fashion. Meal schedules shall correspond to normal community standards with no less than 30 to 40 minutes allotted for each resident's meal. And you know why that was in there? Because they weren't being fed that way. They were being fed in very, very short increments. It also says that residents shall be given liquids at appropriate intervals during each meal, not just at the end of the meal. It goes on and on. Dental services. Painkillers normally associated with dental work shall be administered when needed. Think about that one. The judgment, though, at the very beginning, said stuff that I'm going to read, which is obviously as relevant today as it was in 1975, and hopefully will be always continued relevant. This is what it says. The steps, standards, and procedures are not optimal, nor ideal standards, nor are they custodial standards. They are based on the recognition that retarded persons, regardless of the degree of handicapping conditions, are capable of physical, intellectual, emotional, and social growth, and upon the further recognition that a certain level of affirmative intervention and programming is necessary if that capacity for growth and development is to be preserved and regression prevented. That is what was needed to be said then and what needs to be continued to be said. When we talk about the trajectory of inclusion and where family members come involved, family members have been the most important part of this program. Sure, we've had tremendous lawyers, we've had tremendous staff, we've had tremendous government workers. The very notion, of course, of OPWDD, which earlier on was called OMRDD, that's a product of the Willowbrook Consent Judgment. It was a movement that was going on. It was necessary to bring government in to its own department to oversee the developmentally disabled, to help develop and build community residences. But families are the ones that push that. The plaintiffs in this suit, along with individuals, are the ARCs of New York State. At the time, there were probably 60-some chapters, but there were 62 counties in New York, and each one of them was overseen by a chapter of the ARC. Those ARCs were created by family members, and those ARCs continue today. When we talk about trajectory and we talk about advocacy, and both Clarence and Beth have really hit upon this point, we can't let go. We have to continue to push and continue to bring up the notion of the Willowbrooks because it's important, and to continue to remind our legislators and policymakers that what we did 75 years ago is as relevant today as then and will continue to be. We need to push, push, push. And when you look and you think of how the system works, it works because people are prodded a little bit. That is a fact. And they can be prodded by the Willowbrook Consent Judgment. I think Geraldo also brought up the same idea. We can't forget and we can't go back. So when I think of Willowbrook, I think, Robert Kennedy came out here in 1965. The editor of our local newspaper here, many of you people know Brian Laylon and I were having a short discussion, and on the poster out there talks about Robert Kennedy coming out and calling this a snake pit. Like, what happened? How come we didn't close this place down in 1965, that it took 10 years to do it? Well, it took 10 years. Those 10 years, the parents really began to organize and pull themselves together. So I look at New York State, I look at what we've done, I look at the parent advocacy is just so terribly important. I look at what the lawyers have done, which is very, very important, and I look at what our public officials have done, and especially OPWDD, to keep this up. And I think of myself, I think of my daughter. My daughter is in a community residence, which is about a half a mile from here. In fact, you can go out on her front steps and you look over and you see the tower at the College of Staten Island. That used to be the tower at Willowbrook. And as I said, it's about a half a mile away the crow flies. But if you were to measure that in the distance that New York State has moved from 1975 to today, well, it would take light years. That would be measured only in light years. So we have gone so far, but we need to go further. And my final comment here is that families that are there, parents, siblings, get out there and keep pushing, and reminding everyone of the days of Willowbrook, but how far we've been able to move because of the Willowbrook consent judgment. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Chester, this next question is for you. How did Willowbrook influence self-advocacy for current and future generations, and what would be your advice for future generations of self-advocates? I can only imagine what you're going to say, so let everybody hear it.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all the panelists and your views, and most of all, I'd like to thank you, BJ, for helping make advocacy in this state possible, but also where we want to go in the future. And thanks to OPWDD Willow, the governor's office, the Division of Budget, for helping us to move forward. But before I say that, is that I like to tell self-advocates that in order to make change, you have to do things yourself. I tell them I can retire whenever I want to, get tired, sit in my house, put my feet up on the couch, and watch Oprah. But now...
I'll pretend I didn't hear you say that.
But now possible, I'm not putting my feet up on the couch. I am marching in that army of advocates, family members, and agencies to keep going on what we need and let people know who we are. We have a saying in self-advocacy, nothing about us without us. That should be a motto for all of us, because we should not let money stop us from being the people that we want to be. We should not let that stop us from obtaining our goals, because right now we're sitting in Willowbrook, but we had people like Bernard. We had people like all of the people here to make that happen. We had Geraldo to show the nation that this was happening and it wasn't good. And we had people like Mrs. Goodman to say, I'm not going to take it. We're not going to take it. Families said they wasn't going to take it. So why should now, today, we sit down and say, oh, look what's happening on our TV. We can't do nothing about it. It's the motto that's been around in this country forever. We, the people. Are we we the people to make things happen and make change? Are we the people to do like me and sit on the couch and put our feet up and watch social media go by? No, we're not. Because we're here to make a difference. Every day I go to work, I get phone calls, I talk to parents, and I question myself, am I doing enough to make change? And from the things that's happening now in this country, I tell myself, self, you're not doing enough. You gotta do more. You gotta fight longer, and you can't give up. Because I remember when I was a little boy in my grandmother's house, sitting on the floor in Alabama, watching black and white TV. Yes, we had those at that time. And I saw this man talking about freedom, talking about a dream, and it was Martin Luther King. I never got a chance to meet him, but I got to network and become a friend of his son, Martin Luther King III, and he said to me, how are you going to make your community know who you are and what you want, and how are you going to carry that message? And I think that all of us in this state carries the message, but how far do we carry it? Do we carry it enough to where we can fight that battle, or do we say, oh, I've done enough, I can sit down now? You never can sit down, we can never stop. And it's our job to make sure that it doesn't happen anymore, because Willowbrook got turned into a college, but people's lives are still there. There are people, there are friends of mine that I know that are worried about returning to a place like this. And what you see going on in the country now are scaring people to the point to they think that this might happen. And then we have states that it is happening. But what are we going to do about it? What are we going to say? What are we going to do? Are we going to watch social media go by and say, this is what's happening? You can't do too much about it because it's the government and it's money. You know what? You know what they say about money? Anybody. Money is the root of all evil. So money is evil. So it shouldn't take evil to change a life. It shouldn't take evil to get people out of institutions. Money don't do it, people do. We do. We can make the changes. We can make the nation what we want it to be. And what I was thanking BJ for before is we had, I've worked for OPW 26 years, and that doesn't mean I'm done. I always say I'm done when they put the dirt over me, and so I'm not expecting that no time soon. But what we worked on is getting OPW to understand, if I can be here for over 26 years, BJ can be here for over 23 or so, we can pass that message on and get OPW to hire other people. We can help train other people to do what we do, to advocate like parents, like agencies, like DSPs, to make a change in New York State and not wait for somebody else to do it. So that's why we have advocacy peer support unit at OPW, where we're hiring people with disabilities. And my hope is that we don't stop with the few people that we have already, but we open the doors and welcome more people, because like you heard from Kim from the governor's office, and when she came to our office, they have more people that they've hired to help move the disability movement forward. And the more people we have, the better it is, and the more changes that we can make. Don't just say it, do it, because advocacy is still alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Chester. And before I ask the next question, I just want to follow up on what you said. You know what fear creates? Fear creates silence, and silence creates no action. This is our opportunity now and in the future to continue to take action. Nobody's telling you not to be afraid of what's going on, because there's a lot of stuff going on in today's world, and it's a lot coming at us all at once. But if you let the fear stop you from being who you are, then you're not being who you are. You're not being the voices you need to be to create change. It's up to all of us to create the change. Thank you. Now, Eric, we ran into each other this morning, and I promised you, because we're friends, I'd be nice to you, and I'm going to keep that promise.
Thank you.
So here is your question. What challenges do we face in achieving full inclusion of people with developmental disabilities?
Okay, well, BJ, thank you for the question. And I'm going to kind of give the provider perspective on the panel. The short and, I guess, easy answer to the question is two things that are very closely related: staffing and funding. That's the easy answer. The thing that's harder to answer is why. Why are those things happening? And I'll get back to that. Before I get into my comments, though, I do want to acknowledge this administration, the governor, our partners at OPWDD. As the commissioner said earlier today, over the last 4 years, we have received significant investment into our system. It has helped immensely. And we thank them, especially this last year where there was a significant bump in the rates that we receive for services. Extremely, extremely helpful. But as we sit here today, we realize we still don't have an answer on what the outcome of the budget's going to be. As the other panelists have mentioned, not only are we dealing with uncertainty at the state level, we're also dealing with a lot of uncertainty at the federal level with threats like we've really never seen them before. And while we appreciate the incredible investments that have been made by this administration, we also have to recognize that prior to this period, we went 10 years without a single cent coming into our field, and we took a giant step back. 2 decades ago, the average DSP made twice minimum wage. Today, the average DSP makes just over minimum wage. Here's some startling, even with the investment that we receive, here's some startling data points that I want to share with you. Right now, in our field, 1 in 5 DSP positions is vacant. 1 in 3 positions turns over every year. So we can't get enough people in our doors, and when we get them, we can't keep them. The starting wage right now, even with all the investment that's been made, is still about $20 or less in some instances. That's not a living wage in today's environment. And what's the real impact of all of this? Well, the real impact, of course, is something that we studied a few years ago when we commissioned a study with the University of Miami of Ohio, that 50% of our DSP workforce is food insecure, and 50% of our DSP workforce is housing insecure. Think about that for a second. The very people that we are asking to care for our loved ones and provide them basic needs don't know if their own basic needs are going to be met the next meal or that night when they lay their head down on a pillow. Okay. Staffing is critical to integration and inclusion. Without full staffing, without a skilled workforce, without an engaged workforce, we don't have consistency in care, and we don't have the ability to support people with disabilities to be fully integrated into the broader community. I was talking with Clarence, actually, earlier this week on one of the calls for planning this event, and he made a comment about the difference between integration and inclusion. And I think it's important to discuss those things. Willowbrook resulted in integration. So we closed a giant institution and we opened smaller residences and programs in the community. Wonderful, great. But that's not true inclusion. True inclusion, in some ways I think you could say Our people are still isolated. They're just in smaller programs in the community, but are they really a part of the community? And that's where I think that fourth principle that you mentioned about inclusion comes into play, about valuing people with disabilities. And I don't have to speak to anyone in this room because we all get it. But I think, each year that we have to come back and fight for pennies to maintain our wages and to pay our workforce a living wage says that they don't quite get it. And that's our challenge, I think, as family advocates, as providers, as people with disabilities, is to try to close that gap, move from integration, which we've made incredible progress at, but we haven't achieved full inclusion. And that's what the path forward is going to be focused on, and I hope all of you will partner with me in getting to that point. It's going to take some work. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Jason, this question is for you. What would you like to see the world look like for the future of developmental disability services?
Thank you. Thank you, BJ, and thank you to all the fellow panelists. It's been very insightful. I would also like to just thank everyone who's attending today, OPWDD, and I'm honored and humbled to be the representative of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council. When thinking about the future, we must always consider the past. On this historic day of the 50th anniversary of the Willowbrook Consent Decree, we must acknowledge the deplorable conditions which led to the decree. As Winston Churchill once said, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We've grown leaps and bounds since 1975, but there is so much more to go. I'm going to piggyback off what Eric said, and I'd like to lead with the direct support professional, the heart of all of the voluntary organizations and state-operated providers. Our direct support professionals are not making a livable wage. I look forward to the day when a direct support professional can clock in, work a 40-hour week, and be able to support their family and loved ones. That doesn't exist right now. The direct support professionals are either working double shifts daily or clocking out from one agency to just go to their second job and clock in and do the same thing all over again, and that's just to make ends meet. For all of you that work in this field, and in speaking to Bernard earlier today, he was telling me that we need to advocate stronger for our direct support professionals. He knows firsthand that those are the people that provide him the support to live a fulfilling life. So when I think about the future, the first area that we have to really prioritize, and we've made a lot of strides. The COLA has been in the budget for the last few years, but we need an increased COLA. We need more. We need bonuses. We need to legitimize and professionalize the direct support professional. Speaking of funding, agencies need more support. Yes, there has been an increase in some rates, but there are still many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that aren't able to access services, that can't get into a day program, that can't get into a respite program, that need staff for community rehabilitation. Reason being is, one, we don't have staff. Two, we don't have the means, the supports, and the resources to provide supports for people with complex medical and behavioral needs. There's a disparity amongst people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's very unfortunate. Speaking to family members all the time at the council, expressing their frustration that they can't access services because agencies can't help them because they just don't have the funding for enhanced staffing or the resources or trainings available to support their loved ones. We have individuals, which is great now, that are living to a long age. There's been a lot of medical developments, and thankfully the lifespan has increased significantly. But with that being said, how are we supporting individuals when they age? Are we able to support them in their homes? Are we able to make revisions to their environment to make it more functional and supportive? It's challenging. We've made a lot of strides in continued inclusivity and embracing the community. I think today's a perfect example. When you walk out the doors today or during break and in the beginning of registration, there were 3 agencies that were represented. a very special place on your mark and lifestyles, and individuals that were there working and that made the food and serving the food and had that ability to be inclusive and be out there and represent. It was beautiful to watch that. 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. We have made many strides. The community is more accepting of this population, but we need to continue to get rid of that stigma. That's always going to be a constant struggle. But we have made strides, and we need to continue to do so, and I think we have. Increased understanding and awareness of the particular needs of the IDD community in the medical field. Our individuals deserve medical care just as much as any neurotypical people do. When they're in hospitals, we need doctors to be understanding and accommodations to be made for people that may need extra support. We have individuals that are in the hospital, in the emergency room, waiting for beds for days that struggle, and that can't be. When individuals are in doctor's appointment, they need access to different services and therapies. That needs to continue to be available in the future. And opportunities for more residential programs. Unfortunately, there are thousands of people waiting for residential placement. Families don't have the ability, most families don't have the ability to watch their loved one transition into a group home, to be part of that process, help them integrate into the community, into a congregate care setting. It's really done on a priority basis right now. It's an emergency need that is being prioritized, and that doesn't allow family members to be part of the process. There is a huge need for residential placement. It is scary to have a loved one and at home with you, and you are unable to care for them and not know what's going to happen to them when you're no longer here. With that being said, today we're celebrating, and we have made so many strides in the last 50 years, and I'm confident by looking around the room and amongst many other community leaders and legislators and the leadership of OPWDD, we will continue to do that and get there. We sit here today with pride and progress of what we've made, but we must continue to move forward and transform our field and protect the dignity and rights of the people we support for the next 50 years and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I want to tell one really quick story, if I might, how advocacy never stops. Last night, arrived here, had dinner with my unit, and something wasn't here when I needed it to make sure that I could sleep in the bed before coming here today. And I said, don't worry about it. It happens all the time. But my team is a very active team, and we are a family. They stepped up, were making phone calls, and wouldn't give up until I got the equipment I needed. So this is a reminder to us all. No matter what we advocate for, we all need to come together and remember we have a common goal just to advocate. Speak up, speak out. We are a family. Families, agencies, and self-advocates.
Accessing Life is a podcast produced by the New York State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, known as OPWDD. The producer is Michael Orzel, hosts Chester Finn and BJ Stasio. To learn more about the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, supports and services, go to opwdd.ny.gov.